Good morning, everyone. How are you today? All participants, are you ready to learn about the very important topics of this morning? Okay, in today's lecture series of Senior Recfon, we are going to have Professor Vidici to lecture on meeting calcium intakes in Asia. Professor Chi is currently the president of the Malaysian Dietitian and Dean of the School of Health Sciences, Malaysia. She got her PhD degree in food science and nutrition. So now, Professor Chi, welcome to Simeo Recon online lecture series. Thank you so much for your willingness to join us today. So we can start now, Professor Chi.
Okay.
You have like 20 to 30 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right.
To give your lecture, please.
Okay. I may take a bit more time because I thought it was longer than 30 minutes, but it's okay. I will share my slides now.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much. First of all, selamat pagi to everyone. Thank you very much to Senior Refon for inviting me to give this online lecture. I will now be talking about meeting calcium needs in Asia. Some of the things that I will be covering over the course would be why the concern about calcium, how much calcium is required for Asians, how much calcium is taken in Asia, and how do we achieve adequate calcium intake. So as we all know, calcium, I think many of us in the audience are nutritionists, so you probably know that calcium is an important nutrient. It's the fifth most abundant nutrient in the body. And one of its key roles is in skeletal mineralization. And calcium is also very important for a wide range of biological functions. For example, it regulates cellular metabolism. It's important for wound healing, for nerve impulse transmission, and also for muscle contraction. So I think we can establish that the only way we can get enough calcium is only through dietary sources, which makes this topic today quite important. One of the key roles of calcium is going to be to provide a structural role to skeleton. As we know, calcium together with phosphate will actually form what we call hydroxyapatite minerals, which is embedded in the collagen fibrils of bone. And in bone, calcium serves two main purposes. Number one is to provide skeletal strength, and secondly, the bone is actually a store in order for calcium to be either taken in or out to ensure that the intra and extracellular calcium pool must always remain at a normal range. When we talk about calcium requirement, it is also quite important that we understand how is calcium being absorbed in the body. So intestinal calcium absorption actually occurs in two ways, sorry. Number one is the calcium is being absorbed through an active and saturable transcellular process. So this requires the role of vitamin D in order to transport the calcium from the gut lumen into the blood. The other way that calcium is being absorbed is through what we call the paracellular pathway. And this is in between the cells. And this usually occurs when there is a high calcium in the diet, that the paracellular pathway is then activated. The active form of vitamin D plays a very important role in regulating calcium absorption here. We also know that calcium requirement is dependent on calcium metabolism, which is regulated by the intestinal absorption, renal reabsorption, and the bone turnover. So we'll talk more a little bit about this when we talk about calcium requirement. Vitamin D is also plays a very important role when we talk about calcium homeostasis. As you know, in Asia, many reports come out that Asians tend to have a low vitamin D status. So with a low vitamin D status, it may also impact on calcium balance in terms of um, vitamin D is important that if it is low, it will increase calcium reabsorption. The kidney will do that. There will be mobilization of calcium from the bone, and this will also increase the risk of bone mineralization and bone mineral content. And all of this serves the purpose of maintaining serum calcium to be normal. So why are we so concerned about calcium? I think many of us are very much aware that calcium intake is also very related to the prevalence of rickets and osteomalacia. Although the primary role of rickets and osteomalacia is related to vitamin D, however, vitamin D and calcium is closely linked. So in this way, the vitamin D will require calcium to be in a adequate status in order to prevent conditions such as rickets and osteomalacia in adults. Another important area that we need to consider when we talk about calcium is how calcium can actually impact the growth of children and adolescents. So this very nice study that was reported in 2017 has actually shown that with a low calcium intake, there is a significant difference in the height attachment of our children. I've taken a snapshot of one of the diagram that was published in this paper by Fang et al., which is taken from the Chinese Health and Nutrition Survey. So as you can see from this graph, and this is among boys, and they have adjusted for physical activity in this population, there is a difference in the adult height attainment with low calcium intake. So if you look at the graph, if most of us are eating less than 500 milligram of calcium, you can see that the difference in adult height attainment is much lower compared with those who with higher calcium intake. I think this is a good evidence to actually support that in children, in order for them to attain adult height and adult stature, it is important to have adequate calcium intake. Another study reported by Barros in 2009 actually followed Asian children from the age of 10 years old for 7 years ahead. And they have shown that Asian children who have less calcium intake have lower bone mass accrual in the 7 years. So to me, this is actually adequate evidence that the growth of children is dependent on calcium intake. As we move on to the next phase of life, which is in pregnancy and lactation, again, a very important group of women that we need to pay attention to. Most of us know that calcium is very important during this life stage. And in human pregnancy and lactation, there is a transfer of calcium from the mother to the child. And in the right-hand corner here is the amount of calcium that is being transferred to ensure that fetal growth and also breast milk production is adequate in the mother. What is interesting from this publication by Anne Prentice Group on calcium economy in human pregnancy and lactation is that if you look at this graph here, this is time postpartum to lactation, to post-lactation. And studies have shown that while if the mother does not have adequate calcium, there is a reduction in the bone mineral content about 6 months postpartum. However, the bone mineral content actually resumes back to baseline after 6 months postpartum. This is actually physiological adaptation that occurs to ensure that the fetal growth and the breast milk production is still adequate and is not dependent on any increase on dietary calcium intake, and it doesn't seem to compromise long-term maternal bone health. However, these studies are done in populations that have adequate calcium intake. So the data on low calcium intake populations is still lacking. Another important aspect about calcium intake is its role in osteoporosis and hip fractures. I think majority of us in the audience come from Asian countries, and we may not be aware that Asia is currently put as a high-risk region for increasing in hip fractures. In the Asian Osteoporosis Society membership, and these are the countries who are members of AFOS, they have actually published what is the risk factor for hip fractures increasing in this region. And you can see that in countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, there is a 3 to 4-fold increase in hip fractures by 2050. And this is because of the aging population. Now you may ask, has that got to do with calcium intake? And in a study that was done, hold on, yes, this is actually a study that was published in JBMR many years back, and it's the first multi-center case control study among several countries in Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Hong Kong. And they compare cases of fractures and controls, men and women. They have shown that the relative risk is much higher, it's twofold in women and 1.5-fold in men if the calcium intake is less than 500 milligrams a day. So while there are other lifestyle factors which are related to hip fractures, calcium intake is one of the contributing factors. I apologize, I'm trying to move my slide. Right. So now let's move on to discuss how much calcium do Asians require. Now there are multiple approaches to assess calcium requirement. One is through the measurement of calcium balance in persons who eat different levels of calcium intake. Now this process to assess calcium balance is not a simple procedure. The second way is to look at bone mineral content before and after calcium supplementation. And finally, to look at epidemiologic studies. So the calcium requirement of an adult or child is generally recognized to be the intake required to maintain calcium balance and therefore skeletal integrity. So the first question we could ask is, do Asians absorb calcium better? So this is a study in Hong Kong by Professor Kung that was published quite a few years ago. It showed that fractional calcium absorption seems to be higher in Chinese women compared to Caucasians. And they did this looking at when you give calcium supplements and when there is an unmodified diet or there is a low calcium diet. And you can see here that even in osteoporotic subjects who are Chinese women, there is still 50 to 60% of absorption of calcium. In young control subjects, it's quite similar as well. with age-matched control subjects and also osteoporotic subjects. But this study shows that even in population with low calcium intake, there is still substantial calcium absorption, and it seems to be higher than Caucasians, and this could be due to adaptation. Now, let's move on now to talk about children. This is a very nice study conducted by Steve Abrams' group that looked at population, and in this case girls during early puberty, who eat a low calcium diet. And he has shown that in a low calcium diet compared to a high calcium diet, the percentage of absorption in a low calcium diet is higher than in a high calcium diet. However, the total amount that is being absorbed and the total amount that is being retained is still lower compared to population who obtain adequate calcium intake. So therefore, in the long term, it is still important that we ensure that children have adequate calcium intake, because the deficit of 220 milligrams per day, which he found in his study, if it's being maintained over a prolonged period, will have a considerable impact on total calcium in the bone. This is another study that looks at elderly Japanese population, and similarly, they looked at calcium requirement using balance studies. And the calculations is shown in the slide. And what they have calculated for the Japanese elderly is that in order to maintain calcium balance, the RDA should be around 800 to 900 milligrams per day. Now, what are some of the factors that we need to consider when we are looking at calcium requirement? The first thing is sodium intake. This is a very old study that was reported by FAO/WHO. However, I think it is one of the few studies that have shown that a high sodium intake will require more calcium in the diet. Similarly, with protein consumption as well. If protein consumption is high, especially animal protein, it does lead to a higher calcium loss in the urine and therefore increases calcium requirement. If you look at protein consumption in Asia, and this is by the Euromonitor International, that looked at how much protein is available in Asian countries, you can see that in some of the Asian countries, the protein consumption is quite high. So this will impact how we decide on how much calcium is needed. Vitamin D status is another reason for determining calcium intake. So in this graph, it shows that a 10% reduction in calcium absorption rises in terms of the requirement depending on the vitamin D status. So therefore, in populations that have low vitamin D status, there is a need also to increase the calcium requirement. Now, if you look into how calcium intake and vitamin D status is related to bone mineral density, this study by the Korean Nutrition Examination Survey, the Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, reported that in order to maintain and prevent secondary hyperparathyroidism, we need at least 700 milligrams of calcium And that would be also important to maintain serum vitamin D status to be at least 50 nanomoles per liter. And there has been studies conducted in Asian countries that calcium supplementation may play a role to attenuate bone loss in Asian women. In this study that I did in Malaysia, we have demonstrated that elderly postmenopausal women who drink 2 glasses of milk a day, which provides 1200 milligram of calcium, can actually lead to, within 2 years, less bone loss compared to control groups who do not consume milk and only has about 300 milligrams of calcium intake a day. There has been also studies showing that calcium and vitamin D supplementation can significantly reduce the risk of the fractures in elderly population. And here, most of the studies provide at least 1,000 milligram of calcium. There are also population-based studies and systematic reviews showing that calcium supplements may improve bone density by about 1.8% in a year. And the amount of calcium in these studies are usually between 500 to 1,000 milligrams per day. If you are interested in preventing osteoporosis, one of the key areas that we should focus on is to ensure that children have adequate calcium because of the time of peak bone mass. And it can be seen from this systematic review that increasing calcium either through with dairy can actually increase BMD in children, especially those with low baseline intakes. Hence, if you look at calcium recommendations in Asian countries, this is one of the efforts that was done by the group in ELC, whereby there was a harmonization effort made to look at RDAs across different types of nutrients. I'm just focusing on the one on calcium. And these are the values that you can see across the lifespan on the different requirements for calcium. So for infants, it's around 300 to 400 milligrams per day. As the child grows, it's between 500 to 700. During the teenage years, where peak bone mass is on, then you need about 1,000 milligram. And in adults, it ranges between 700 to 1,000 milligram, including in pregnancy and lactation. It is therefore important to also look into what are some of the recommendations by other societies that look at postmenopausal women. And this is for the purpose of preventing osteoporosis and also hip fractures. And it's usually recommended to be around 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams per day. The upper limit for calcium, according to the IOM, is around 2,500 to 3,000 milligram a day. So how much calcium are Asians really eating? Now, there has been very recent interest in the amount of calcium eaten among adults. And if you look at Asia, it is reported that in South and Eastern Asia, we have the world's lowest average calcium intake. And very often, it is less than 400 milligrams per day. And this would be alarming because I also mentioned to you that Asia is likely is predicted to have the highest rate of hip fractures in 2050. So we really do need to look into improving calcium intake. Similarly, in children, even our kids are eating very low calcium So if you look at RNIs across these countries in Asia, which are in the range of 800 to 1,000, even 1,300 milligrams, the amount actually consumed by children is only 1/3 of that amount. And very high percentage of our population are actually not meeting the RNI. And this interesting publication showed that perhaps the calcium intake is highly correlated with the amount of milk consumed. So Asia has one of the lowest consumption of milk, and this could also contribute to the low calcium intake. The amount of servings of milk in Asia was reported to be only 0.05 to 0.3 servings a day, so not even one serving of milk a day. The other challenge that Asia has in terms of milk consumption is lactose intolerance. So again, the percentage of the population with high lactose intolerance are mostly in the Asian countries, even up to 100% of prevalence of lactose intolerance. In children, it's also reported to be quite high, between 12 to 30% of children who have lactose intolerance. In terms of other non-dairy calcium intake in Asia, these are some of the publications that I've managed to put together. In Japan, other sources of calcium are from soybean, green and yellow vegetables. In Korea, it is coming from seafood, from grains, and from green leafy vegetables. And in Malaysia, we have also done some studies to show that cocoa-based drinks, which is highly fortified with calcium, seem to be a significant contributor of calcium. However, most of these drinks are also sugar-laden. Other sources include cereals, as well as green leafy vegetables and eggs. So is it necessary that we need to promote milk? If you look at the absorption of calcium in milk, it is the highest. So it's around 32%. In other non-dairy sources, the percentage of calcium absorption, although it's high, the amount of calcium that is being absorbed in terms of milligram is much lower than milk. And therefore, if you wish to meet calcium requirement equivalent to a glass of milk, you do need to eat quite a large amount of vegetables, up to here in terms of spinach, for example, up to 15 servings of spinach to be equivalent to the calcium in a glass of milk. So this sometimes can pose practicality issues. So with this, how are we going to achieve adequate calcium intake? Let's first look into why calcium recommendations are not met. One of the key issues here is food habits. We have often read that children, and sometimes even adults, prefer to substitute milk for other drinks, especially soft drinks. There's a lot of eating away from home, from which milk is then not available. And in Malaysia and many Asian countries perhaps, we do see a very high prevalence of meal skipping, especially breakfast, where it is customary usually for us to take milk as a breakfast item. In some population, there's also an issue of cost. Dairy milk dairy foods, milk and cheese can be very expensive to purchase. I've already discussed the prevalence of lactose intolerance being quite high. There's also a lack of knowledge between the importance of calcium and health, and what are the main food sources of calcium that populations should eat. In terms of calcium fortified foods, which is actually a good means of improving calcium intake, in some countries, even in Malaysia, there's low availability of such foods. And we may also consider the use of supplements for some high-risk target groups. So populations at greatest risk of calcium deficiency that we need to focus on include women because of their high risk of developing osteoporosis, in the elderly, and also in children and adolescents. Some of the strategies to improve calcium intakes include, firstly, let us promote local foods with high calcium bioavailability. We have actually shown studies that show that the local food such as tempeh actually has an equivalent fractional calcium absorption compared to milk. We can also look into calcium enrichment and fortification and supplementation in populations that need it. And thirdly, to consider functional ingredients that can help promote calcium absorption. In Malaysia, for example, we do see that there are ethnic differences in terms of what kind of non-dairy calcium food sources that we can promote. For example, amongst the Malay population, ikan bilis or anchovies, sardines, and soybean are things that are quite well accepted and can help improve calcium intake. Among the Chinese, promoting soybean drink, and tofu is more acceptable. Among the Indians, it's more about ikan bilis and soybean drink. Other sorts of calcium fortified foods that are available, maybe not across all countries, but in Malaysia, we can have milk, which is calcium fortified. This is actually not dairy, but it's oat milk, breakfast cereals, and cocoa-based and malt-based beverages. As I mentioned, in Malaysia, we have found that drinks such as Milo, which is calcium fortified, because the children drink a lot of it, it actually contributes to calcium intake. However, it also comes with high sugar. Orange juice can also be fortified with calcium. Biscuits have been fortified with calcium and is available. And this is actually mineral water that has been fortified with inulin, which is a prebiotic that has been shown to improve calcium absorption. Calcium supplements is often recommended, especially for elderly population that have a high risk of hip fracture. And you can see here that the different types of calcium supplements will have different absorption rate, but they are more or less comparable. So calcium supplements can be recommended for individuals with osteoporosis or osteopenia, perimenopausal and postmenopausal women, women who have to breastfeed multiple infants, vegans, residents in nursing homes, those with lactose intolerance and are high risk, individuals who are taking chronic steroids therapy, because this will deplete their calcium stores. The use of functional fibers that may help improve calcium absorption is also another way to improve calcium intake. These are usually non-digestible carbohydrates that can be isolated from a food source and synthesized and seem to have physiologic effects in humans. Take, for example, the prebiotic fiber inulin and fructooligosaccharides. This is a study that was done that showed that prebiotic fibers can actually improve calcium absorption by 3 to 12%, and also after 1 year showed that there is improvement in skeletal health in terms of bone mineral content and bone mineral density, especially in young adolescents. And if we can improve the calcium absorption and the calcium deposition into bone, this may have benefit in terms of peak bone mass attainment and increased skeletal calcium accretion. So in summary, I hope I have covered why the concern about calcium, because calcium is important for prevention of rickets, osteomalacia. It's important for height attainment in children, bone density, and peak bone mass attainment. In adults, it's important during pregnancy and lactation, and in elderly for the prevention of osteoporosis and fractures. How much calcium is required for Asians? It depends on the age of the individual and the population, and it ranges from 300 to 400 milligrams during infancy, and this is mostly obtained from breast milk. In children, 500 to 700 milligrams. In adolescents and adults, it is much higher, around the range of 1,000 milligrams per day. However, I've also shown that Asians are eating less than 500 milligrams per day, and we have the lowest calcium intake in the world. And how do we achieve this intake? Promotion of local food sources, food fortification and supplementation, and perhaps the use of functional ingredients that help improve calcium absorption can be a solution. In conclusion, I think all of us as nutrition professionals should continue to encourage our population to include calcium sources as part of a healthful and well-balanced diet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Interesting lecture and very informative. So now I'd like to call the audience. If any one of you would like to raise questions or more information on calcium. Itu semuanya yang itu kan? Gitu. Oke.
Okay. So I think the question here, is calcium related to growth of body height? Yes, apparently from the studies that have been shown, they have looked at the calcium intake and the attainment of adult height in children, in boys and in girls. And this is from the China Nutrition Survey. And they have shown that calcium is related to how much height that is being attained by the children. So those with low calcium intake tend to be shorter compared to those who have adequate calcium intake. I think there's a question here also about calcium supplements during pregnancy. Is it necessary? Now, during pregnancy, if you look at the RNI, you need about, I think in some countries, between 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams, right? During pregnancy. So as you know, in Asian women, there tend to be a lack of calcium intake. So they eat only around 3 to 400 milligram. So in order to meet that requirement, you will have to encourage the mothers to increase calcium intake. In my experience, most mothers who are pregnant, if you ask them to start drinking milk, they will. So not necessarily that they need to do calcium supplements, because usually mothers who are pregnant, they are very concerned about their children. So they will follow your advice. So in Malaysia, we have mothers who drink and things, milk which are specially formulated for pregnant women. So then it will have enough calcium in the diet. But if they really cannot take enough dairy products and other sources of calcium is also not possible, then perhaps calcium supplements may be needed. But it's interesting in the studies that especially amongst the Gambian women that was done by Anne Prentice group in the UK, she showed that during pregnancy, the increased physiological adaptation is actually very high. So even with low calcium intake, there is no detriment to the fetal growth and the mother's bone density. So after 6 months postpartum, the bone density goes back to normal. But in the long term, there may be impact on bone mineral content. So she still recommends that they should meet the RNI for calcium intake.
Anyone else? Audience, participants? Right. From Michelle, I think, yeah?
Can calcium supplement cause calcification? Okay. Now, I think a couple of years back, there was a lot of concern about this, in elderly women who are osteoporotic, who are given calcium supplements. They saw that there's an increased rate of this calcification. However, when you look at the latest literature, it seems that this is no longer a concern. So the calcification in arteries is not directly related to the calcium supplements that's being given. So if you give calcium supplements within the RNI, there should not be any issue.
Well, I think
this is about the prebiotic study. Yes. Now, this particular study that I showed is mainly done on inulin and fructan. So it's a combination of inulin and fructan, and also phosgos has been shown to improve calcium absorption. So there are quite a lot of, not all types of prebiotic, but only certain ratio. And the strongest study that we saw just now was on inulin. It has been shown to improve calcium absorption. But this calcium absorption, does it translate into long-term improvement in bone density? The data is still not very strong. So we need more studies to show that.
Sorry, you're talking about inulin, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Prebiotic, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So there's a question about bioavailability for fortification food. I have not looked at the data, so I'm not sure whether if you fortify, you get the same bioavailability. So I'm not sure. I suppose if you fortify the food with calcium, they would normally use calcium salt, so there should be absorption. It says here that the next question is calcium absorption decreased by age. So is it necessary to increase calcium intake? Yes. So in postmenopausal women, you saw that the requirements of the RNI is usually higher in postmenopausal. So there is a need to increase calcium requirement. So it should be around 1,200 milligram for some countries. For some countries, it's 1,000 milligram for elderly. Can you explain how RDA for calcium among formula fat higher than fresh fat? Now, I can't quite remember the data, but we did look at it when we wrote the RNI for Malaysia. I think in breast fat, the absorption of calcium is higher in breastfeeding. So if you're using formula fat, then I suppose the absorption is lower. So I cannot quite answer that, Dr. Judy. I need to look into the data. Can't remember.
Maybe I just interrupt a little bit. Is it due to
Sure.
the high protein in the formula? Do you think? Because you explained about
Yeah.
higher
The
protein. I
protein?
don't know.
I don't think so. I think it's more about the physiological absorption of calcium during lactation.
Thank you.
How to handle stunted children? That I think the stunting is more perhaps related to the overall quality of the diet, the energy content, the protein content, and not necessarily just directly because of calcium. How to control sugar eating? So I suppose if you are trying to promote calcium fortified food, we should put it in a medium that is also healthy. So it's not related to putting it in sugary drinks and so on. Yeah. So in Malaysia, what we saw was actually the Milo, the cocoa drink is very popular. So our children will drink at least 2-3 times a day. So that is actually contributing to calcium intake. So we advise the mother to not add things like susu pekat manis, together when they make the Milo. So it's better to use milk powder. So that will also help to increase calcium and limit the sugar content. I think the company has also tried to reduce the sugar content in these sort of drinks. So that will help. Any factors that inhibit absorbed calcium? Okay. So there are factors such as, the undigestible fiber, that's phytate, for example, that can help with reduce calcium absorption. But it's interesting to show that the group in Purdue University, I think Professor Connie Weaver, has shown that in some of these vegetables which are low in phytate content, their absorption is actually quite good. So we can encourage those sort of vegetables that have low phytate content and increase
I think,
calcium
yeah.
availability.
I think in your slides, Professor, sorry, in your slides, I think broccoli and kale, I
That's
think
right.
quite,
Kale.
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
It seems to be very well absorbed. And
yeah,
tempeh
yeah.
is also good
Tempeh,
sources.
yeah, tempeh,
Yeah.
very good.
Consuming dairy products is low in Asia, yes. Whether pasteurized or UHT, I think that it makes no difference in terms of calcium intake. Does consuming cow's milk under 5, if they do not have any problems like cow's milk allergy, I don't think there's an issue. Yeah,
Okay, maybe one question from me, is it okay?
sure, of course, of course.
Yeah, yeah. You see, since most of Asians, we have problems, with the absorption.
Yeah,
And we know that the soybean actually rich in calcium. However, the phytate content is quite high.
yeah,
So I wonder if, why, for example, in one of your slides
mhm,
showing that tempeh is about
yeah,
34% absorption versus milk only 36. So that means it's very
similar.
close, similar, yeah. And why is it? Because due to the fermentation process, that's how
Okay.
the tempeh is more absorbable or
Yeah.
bioavailable.
So
How
that
is it?
study was done by my colleague in UKM, Dr. Hasna, and she used isotopes actually, calcium isotopes to look into the absorption. And she found that it's comparable with milk. Even Connie Weaver's group looked at soy, and they still show about 20 to 20% absorption. So it is quite good. So despite the phytate content, so maybe it's fermentation, maybe the phytate is not high compared to maybe vegetables, so that
Yeah.
calcium is still being absorbed.
So tempeh is a good news
Good
for
choice. Yes, it's good news for Indonesia.
you think, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else would like to raise questions for Professor Chi? Any participants? So if not,
Yep.
maybe we can conclude that
Yep.
Asian has problem with calcium intake due to
Mhm.
their diet and etc. But we have some hopes there that a certain natural source,
Mhm.
not milk, because we have maybe problem with milk due to our lactose intolerance problem, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Then we can always modify, right,
Yes.
our intake for calcium, which is it's again balanced nutritious diet, right?
That's right. That's right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and this
Thank
one
you.
more. Yeah. I want to add question: is it fine to drink milk with
Oh
coffee?
yeah, absolutely. But not more than 2 cups a day for the coffee. But I think we are encouraging people here, if you have to drink coffee, please add some milk and not sweet condensed milk, but out,
Okay.
low fat milk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you
All
so much.
right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor
Thank
Chi.
you. Have a good
Thank you
day.
very much, and see you next time.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye.